Mia Calloway was 26 years old, and she worked at a small bakery in a quiet Ohio town where most people knew each other by first name and had families that showed up on holidays and filled their houses with noise and laughter and the smell of home-cooked food. But Mia had none of that, and she never really did from the time she was 4 years old and her mother left and never came back. She had been passed from one foster home to another like a package nobody quite wanted to keep. She remembered counting the number of beds she had slept in before she turned 18, and she stopped counting at 19 because the number made her chest feel heavy. And she did not like that feeling, so she learned early on to just keep moving forward and not look back too long, because looking back never changed anything. It only made the present harder to stand in. And so she built herself a quiet little life in this town she had landed in almost by accident after aging out of the foster system at 18, with a small bag of clothes, a birth certificate, and $73 that a caseworker had handed her in an envelope without even making eye contact. And Mia had taken that envelope and walked out of that office, and she had never looked back, not once, not even when it was hard, and it was hard many times more than she could count. But she was the kind of person who kept going, not because she was fearless, but because stopping felt worse than moving, so she kept moving. And eventually she found herself here in this little Ohio town with a job at a bakery called Clover and Crumbs, where she woke up before the sun every single morning and shaped dough and ice cakes and watched the town slowly come to life through the foggy front window. And there was something she genuinely loved about that part of the day, the silence before everything started. The way the town looked almost peaceful when the streets were still empty, and the snow was falling soft and undisturbed. And nobody was asking her anything or needing anything from her, and she could just exist quietly without having to perform okayness for anyone, because Mia had spent most of her life performing okayness, and she was very good at it. She had learned that people got uncomfortable when you told them the truth about your life, when you said, "I grew up in foster care and I have no family, and the holidays are actually the hardest time of year for me." Instead of saying that she had learned to smile and say, "Oh, the holidays are so busy," and nod along and laugh at the right moments, and nobody ever pressed further because people generally believe what they want to believe, and what they wanted to believe was that everyone around them had more or less the same kind of life they did, and Mia let them believe it because it was easier for everyone involved. But this particular December was different in a way she had not prepared for her closest friend Danielle, the one person in this town who knew most of her story, was getting married on the 26th of December, the day after Christmas, and the entire wedding weekend was being hosted at Danielle's family estate outside Columbus, and it was going to be 3 full days of Danielle's enormous, warm, overwhelming family asking Mia questions the way big families do, with curiosity and zero filter. And for months now, every time Danielle talked about the wedding, she would casually mention something one of her aunts had said or one of her cousins had asked, and always circled back to Mia, and specifically to Mia's love life, because apparently the one thing Danielle's family had decided about their daughter's quiet orphan friend was that she needed to be paired up and taken care of. And while Mia knew it came from a good place, it made her feel something she could not quite name. A mixture of embarrassment and exhaustion, and the very specific loneliness of being the person everyone pities without realizing they are doing it. And she did not want to walk into that wedding weekend alone. She did not want the same gentle questions with the same gentle deflections, while watching every single person there lean into someone and belong to someone. And she did not want to feel the way she always felt in rooms full of families, which was like a window looking in at a warmth she could see but not touch. So one evening in early December, she was sitting on her small apartment couch with her laptop open and a half-eaten bowl of noodles beside her, and she was not even entirely sure what she was searching for. She had been scrolling through some forum where someone had posted a thread about social anxiety and attending events. Alone and buried in the comments, someone had left a link to a website called companion now, and at first she scrolled right past it, but then she scrolled back because the name stuck in her head, and she clicked on it more out of tired curiosity than any real intention, and the website was simple and clean, and it described itself as a service providing platonic social companions for events and gatherings. No romance, no pressure, just a friendly, convincing presence to help people navigate situations that were easier with someone by their side. And Mia sat there reading the whole thing twice, and on the one hand, she knew it was a little strange, and on the other hand, she was a 26-year-old woman who had survived 19 foster homes and aged out of the system with $73, and she had made stranger decisions under less pressure than this, so she kept reading and she found the pricing, and for a single evening, the starting rate was $50, which was not nothing to her. $50 was almost a full shift at the bakery, and she knew that, and she felt it, but she also knew that walking into Danielle's wedding weekend alone meant 3 days of being the object of everyone's gentle pity, and she had been someone's object of pity for most of her life, and she was tired of it. She wanted just once to walk into a room and feel like she had something of her own, even if it was only borrowed for a weekend. And so before she could overthink it any further, she filled out the intake form. She listed the dates. She described the event as a wedding weekend with family gatherings and formal dinners. She answered the questions about what she was looking for in a companion: someone calm. She wrote, someone who does not talk too much or try too hard, someone who can just be present without making it weird. And then she got to the payment page, and she looked at the $50 amount for a long moment, and she thought about the grocery run she had been planning to do that weekend, and she thought about the small crack in her phone screen she had been saving to get fixed, and she thought about all of that. And then she entered her card number anyway and pressed confirm, and the page refreshed with a little message that said your companion request has been received and a follow-up email will be sent within 24 hours. And Mia closed the laptop and finished her noodles and did not let herself feel too much about it one way or another, because that was another thing she had learned growing up. You cannot afford to feel too much about things before they happen, because half the time they fall apart before they start, and she had learned to wait and see before she invested any real emotion. And so she waited, and the next morning there was an email in her inbox with a name and a brief profile and a suggested meeting time at a coffee shop 3 days before the wedding weekend. And she read the email once and then closed it and went to work and shaped her dough and watched the snow fall outside the bakery window, and told herself it was just a practical decision, nothing more than that. Just a woman solving a problem, the only way she could think of with the resources she had, and the $50 she had spent felt less like desperation and more like the quiet, determined act of someone who had always figured things out on her own and was simply doing it again. The coffee shop Mia had chosen was a small place on the corner of 2 quiet streets called Birchwood Brew, and she liked it because it was never too loud, and the booths in the back were private enough that a conversation could happen without half the town overhearing it. And she arrived 10 minutes early, which was something she always did, not out of eagerness but out of habit, because growing up the way she did, you learned that being late meant missing things, and missing things sometimes had consequences, so punctuality had become something she carried in her body without even thinking about it. And she sat in the corner booth with her hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, and she watched the door, and she told herself again that this was just practical, just a simple arrangement between 2 adults, and there was nothing embarrassing about it except that her heart was beating a little faster than she wanted it to, as she noticed that and told it to stop, and it did not stop. And then the door opened, and he walked in, and the first thing she noticed was that he was not what she had built up in her head the night before, when anxiety had painted a picture of someone loud or overly cheerful, or the kind of person who performed friendliness like a stage act she had been bracing for. Someone who would make her feel like she had made a mistake, but the man who stood at the door and looked around The room quietly was none of those things. He was tall, and he moved without rushing, and his eyes scanned the room in a calm, unhurried way, and when they landed on her, he gave a small nod and walked over and sat down across from her without making any of it a production. And he said his name was Nate, and she said her name was Mia, and they shook hands across the table, and that was that. And she noticed his handshake was firm, but not the kind of firm that is trying to prove something, just steady and present. And he looked at her the way someone looks at a person they are genuinely trying to understand, rather than the way people usually looked at Mia, which was with that soft tilted head energy that meant they were already feeling sorry for her before she had said anything. And she appreciated that more than she could have explained in that moment. And he asked if she wanted anything else from the counter before they started, and she said no. And he flagged down the server anyway and ordered himself a plain coffee, and when it arrived, he just held it and waited, and she realized she was going to have to be the one to start talking, so she pulled out the small notes she had written on her phone, and she began walking him through the basics of the wedding weekend, the timeline, the people he would likely meet, the things she had already told Danielle's family about herself, which were mostly true with a few softened edges, and he listened without interrupting. And when she paused, he asked questions that were specific and useful, not the kind of questions people asked to fill silence, but the kind that showed he had actually been paying attention. And he asked things like, what does Danielle's mother care most about, or is there anyone at this weekend who already knows you well enough that we need to be careful about consistency? And those questions were smart, and they made Mia feel less like she was doing something slightly unhinged and more like she was simply preparing for something with someone competent by her side. And after about 20 minutes of logistics, she put her phone face down on the table and looked at him properly for the first time since he had sat down. And she said, honestly, I was not expecting someone like you. And he said, what were you expecting? And she thought about it for a second and said, someone who was trying harder, and something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but close to one. The kind of almost smile that meant something had landed. And he said he had learned a long time ago that trying too hard usually had the opposite effect. And she nodded because she knew that was true. She had watched people try too hard her whole life, social workers who used their bright, cheerful voices and said things like, how are we feeling today? And she had never once believed any of them, and so she understood what he meant, and she respected it, and the conversation moved from logistics into something a little more human, the way conversations sometimes do when both people are tired of performing. And she found herself telling him things she had not planned to say. She told him about growing up in foster care, not with the practiced brevity she usually used, the two-sentence version. She kept polished and ready for situations where it was unavoidable, but with a little more detail, a little more texture. She told him about the Christmas she was 9 years old, and the foster family she was staying with at the time had biological kids of their own, and she had watched them open gifts on Christmas morning from a seat slightly to the side, slightly outside the circle, and she had smiled through the whole thing and thanked the foster mother for the small gift she had been given, which was a coloring book and a pack of crayons, and she had taken it to her room and sat with it and been quietly grateful because she knew it could have been nothing, and he did not say anything for a moment after she said that. And she appreciated that too, because most people rush to fill silence after something like that with words that were meant to comfort, but usually just change the subject faster than felt right. And instead he just held his coffee and let the moment exist. And then he said that sounds like it took a lot of quiet strength, and he said it plainly without the soft voice people used when they were pitying you. And she felt something loosen slightly in her chest, something she had not realized was tight. And she looked at him again and thought there is something unusual about this person, and she did not know yet what it was, but she felt it the way you sometimes feel things before you can name them. And what Mia did not know sitting in that corner booth with her hands around her cooling coffee was that the man across from her was carrying his own version of that particular loneliness. The kind that comes not from having nothing, but from having everything arranged around you in a way that makes genuine human connection feel nearly impossible, because Nate Harlow had grown up inside one of the wealthiest privately held families in the Midwest, and his childhood had been full of every material thing and almost entirely empty of the kind of ordinary, warm human mess that Mia had been longing for her entire life. And after his father died 2 years ago and left him holding the weight of a $4 billion company, he had found himself surrounded by advisors and lawyers and people who needed things from him, and he had felt more alone inside all of that than he ever had before. And so he had done something that surprised everyone who knew him. He had stepped back from the executive role, handed the day-to-day operations to a board he trusted, and walked away into something quieter. And the therapist he had been seeing had said to him at some point that he needed to find ways to engage with the world that were not filtered through his last name. And one thing had led to another in the strange way that life sometimes moves, and he had ended up signing up for the companion platform on a quiet Tuesday night, not entirely sure what he was doing, but doing it anyway, because doing nothing felt worse. And he had accepted a few bookings, and each one had been fine and polite and uneventful, and he had not felt much of anything during any of them, and he had almost closed the account before Mia's request came through. And something about the way she had filled out the form, the plainness of it, the line that said someone who can just be present without making it weird, had made him accept it. And sitting across from her now in this small coffee shop, he was starting to understand why. Because she was the most unperforming person he had met in years, and there was something about that that made him want to stay in the conversation longer than the hour they had scheduled. And when she finally looked at the time and said, "I think we have enough to work with," he nodded, and they both stood, and she thanked him with a handshake that was as steady as his own, and walked out into the cold. And Nate stood at the counter for a moment after she left, and finished the last of his coffee, and thought about the coloring book and the pack of crayons, and felt something settle in him that he could not quite name. But that felt important. The drive to Columbus took just under 2 hours, and Mia spent most of it watching the winter landscape pass outside. The car window, bare trees and gray sky, and fields dusted with snow that looked like someone had laid a thin white sheet over everything. And she had her bag packed in the back seat and her hands in her lap, and she was going over the details in her head, the way she always did before walking into a situation that required her to be a version of herself that looked easy and unbothered. And she had gotten very good at that version over the years. But this was different, because this time there was another person involved, and that meant 2 sets of details to keep straight, and 2 people who had to move through a weekend together in a way that looked natural. And she had texted Nate that morning just to confirm the arrival time, and he had replied with a simple "on my way," and that was it. And she had appreciated that he was not the kind of person who filled space with unnecessary words. And when they arrived at Danielle's family estate separately, as they had planned, Mia pulled up first and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house, which was large and warm-looking, with lights strung along the porch, railing and wreaths on every window, and smoke curling from the chimney, and cars already filling the circular driveway. And she could hear noise from inside, even from where she was sitting, the particular kind of noise that only comes from a house full of people who belong to each other. And she took a slow breath and got out of the car. Nate pulled in right behind her, almost perfectly timed, and he got out and came around and picked up her bag before she could reach for it herself. And she looked at him, and he said, "Better to start, as we mean to go on." And she nodded, because he was right. And they walked up to the front door together, and Danielle opened it before they even knocked, because Danielle had probably been watching from the window for the last 10 minutes. And she came out with her arms wide and pulled Mia into a long hug and whispered in her ear, "You look great." And then she turned to Nate and introduced herself with the kind of open, warm energy that was so specifically Danielle that Mia felt a rush of genuine affection for her friend in that moment. And Nate shook Danielle's hand and said congratulations and meant it, and Danielle gave Mia a look over his shoulder that said I approve, and they went inside. And the house swallowed them whole into noise and warmth and the smell of something incredible cooking in the kitchen, and there were people everywhere. Cousins and aunts and uncles and family friends and a grandmother in a large armchair by the fire who seemed to be the quiet center of gravity for the entire room, and Mia moved through it. All with the practiced ease she had built over a lifetime of learning how to exist in spaces that were not made for her, and Nate stayed close, not in a hovering way, but in a way that felt natural and present, like he actually wanted to be near her and not like he was performing proximity. And at one point, Danielle's mother came over and took both of Mia's hands in hers and said, "We have heard so much about you, dear," and asked how long Mia and Nate had been together. And Mia said about 7 months, which was the story they had agreed on, and Nate added that they had met through a mutual friend and kept it casual for a while before it became something real, and he said it so easily that Mia almost believed it herself. And Danielle's mother looked at Nate with the particular look that mothers give to the people their loved ones bring home, the look that is measuring and warm at the same time, and then she nodded slightly to herself, as if she had reached a conclusion she was satisfied with, and moved on to check on something in the kitchen. And Mia exhaled, and Nate very quietly said, "Nice work," and she almost laughed. And that almost laugh felt like the loosening of something that had been wound tight since she left her apartment that morning. And the first evening moved through dinner and wine and long table conversations, and at some point someone put Christmas music on low in the background, and the grandmother told a story about a Christmas 40 years ago that had everyone at the table either laughing or close to tears. And Mia sat and listened and let herself be in the room without watching it from outside herself the way she sometimes did. And at one point she realized Nate had refilled her water glass without her asking, and she looked at him, and he was already in a conversation with Danielle's uncle, the retired investigator, whose name was Gerald, and who had the kind of quiet, watchful eyes that made Mia slightly nervous when she first met him, because men who observed everything and said little were either very kind or very dangerous. And she was not yet sure which Gerald was, but Nate was handling him with ease, talking about logistics and supply chains in a way that was detailed and knowledgeable. And Gerald was leaning in slightly, the way people do when they realize the person they are talking to actually knows what they are talking about. And Mia noticed that but filed it away because the evening was going well and she did not want to pull at any threads that might unravel something good. And after dinner, people broke into smaller groups, and Mia ended up on the back porch with Danielle and 2 of her cousins, and they were talking about the wedding ceremony and what Danielle was most nervous about. And inside, through the glass door, Mia could see Nate sitting with Gerald and 2 other men around the fireplace, and they were talking easily, and Nate had his elbows on his knees and was listening more than he was speaking. And there was something about the way he held himself that Mia kept noticing, the way he was never performing anything. He was just there, fully present in whatever conversation he was in, and not scanning the room for something better, the way people sometimes did at parties. And Danielle nudged Mia with her shoulder and said, "He is really good." And Mia said he is, and meant it more than she expected to. And that night, after everyone had drifted to their rooms, Mia lay in the guest bed in the dark, staring at the ceiling and trying to be sensible with herself, the way she always tried to be sensible, as she reminded herself of the arrangement and the $50 and the agreement they had made. And she told herself that what she was feeling was just relief that the evening had gone well, and that it was easy to mistake relief for something else. When you were tired and it was late and the house around you was full of a warmth you had never really had access to before. But even as she told herself all of that, she kept coming back to the moment after dinner, when she had been helping carry plates to the kitchen, and she had said something quietly funny under her breath to no one in particular, just a habit. She had of narrating things to herself, and Nate had been right behind her and had heard it and had laughed a real laugh. Not the polite kind, but the kind that comes out before you have decided to let it, and she had turned around surprised, and they had looked at each other for one unguarded second, and then the moment had passed and they had moved on, but she kept returning to it the way you return to something that felt true, and the next morning arrived cold and bright with frost on. The windows in the house came alive early with the energy of a family that treated mornings like events, and there was breakfast laid out on the long kitchen table, and someone had made enough food for twice the number of people there, and Nate was already downstairs when Mia came down, and he had a coffee ready for her on the counter without her saying anything. And she stopped when she saw it and looked at him, and he just nodded toward the coffee and said, "You seem like a 2 cups before talking kind of person." And she said, "How did you know?" And he said, "The way you held your mug at the coffee shop like it was low-bearing." And she took the coffee and stood beside him at the kitchen counter, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and it was the most comfortable silence she had been in for as long as she could remember. And across the kitchen, Gerald was watching them over the top of his own coffee cup with those quiet, observant eyes, and he was not saying anything. But he was thinking something, and whatever it was, he kept it entirely to himself for now. It was the second evening of the wedding weekend, and the house had shifted into that particular energy that happens the night before a big event when everyone is slightly elevated, and the laughter is louder, and the wine is flowing a little more freely, and long tables had been set up in the main dining room with candles running down the center, and the kind of flickering warm light that makes everything look more beautiful than it maybe is. And Mia was sitting near the middle of the table between Nate and one of Danielle's older aunts, who had a gift for asking personal questions, wrapped in the packaging of friendly conversation, and she had already navigated 3 of them with the practiced ease she had spent years developing, and the evening was going well enough that Mia had let herself relax slightly more than she probably should have, because relaxing too much in situations like this was how you got caught off guard, and getting caught off guard was something Mia had always tried to avoid. And then it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that things sometimes shift when you are not looking directly at them. Because Gerald had been sitting at the far end of the table, and he had spent most of dinner the way he spent most of everything, which was listening more than talking, and watching more than engaging, and somewhere between the main course and dessert. He had excused himself and gone upstairs, and nobody thought anything of it, and he had come back down about 15 minutes later, and he had sat next to Danielle and said something low and close to her ear, and Mia had not seen it happen, but Danielle had looked up from that whisper and across the long table at Mia with an expression that was hard to read from a distance, something between surprise and concern, and something else that Mia could not quite name. And then Danielle had composed herself and smiled, and the evening had continued, and Mia had told herself she was imagining things because she had spent enough of her life anticipating disaster that sometimes she saw it in things that were not there. And after dinner, when people were moving into the living room and the kitchen and the small side room with the piano, Danielle appeared at Mia's elbow and said, "Can I steal you for a second?" And her voice was gentle and careful in the way it only got when she was about to say something she was not sure how to say, and they stepped into the small hallway off the kitchen, and Danielle looked at her for a moment and then said, Gerald looked him up, and Mia felt the words land somewhere in her stomach before she fully understood them. And she said, "What?" And Danielle said he recognized the last name Harlow, and he looked it up. And Mia, "He's not just some guy from a companion website." And Mia stood very still the way she did when something hit her that she needed a moment to process. She said, "What do you mean?" And Danielle said his family runs the Harlow Group. Mia, it is one of the biggest privately held companies in the country, and his name has been in business news for years. And Mia looked at the wall just past Danielle's shoulder, and something moved through her that she could not immediately identify. It was not one clean feeling, it was several feelings arriving at the same time in a way that made it hard to know which one to stand in first, and she said, "He did not tell me." And Danielle said, "I know." And Mia said he let me pay him $50. And Danielle was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "Maybe that is not the whole story." And Mia said, "What other story is there?" And Danielle did not have an answer for that. And Mia excused herself and walked back through the kitchen and out the back door into the cold night air because she needed to be outside. She needed the cold and the dark and the quiet. And she stood on the back porch with her arms wrapped around herself and the frost on the grass catching the light from the windows. And she thought about the coffee shop and the way he had listened, and the coffee already waiting on the counter that morning, and the real laugh and all of the small, precise moments she had cataloged without meaning to. And she felt something she recognized from a long time ago, the feeling of having let her guard down and been wrong to do it, not because someone had hurt her yet, but because she had forgotten to protect herself, and forgetting to protect herself had historically been the beginning of being hurt, and she did not know how long she stood there before she heard the back door open behind her, and she knew without turning around that it was him, because of course it was him. And he came and stood beside her and did not say anything at first, just stood there in the cold, looking out at the same dark garden she was looking at. And after a moment he said, "I should have told you." And she said, "Yes, you should have." And he said, "I know." And she turned to look at him and said, "Why didn't you?" And he looked at her steadily and said, "Because the last name changes how people hear everything that comes after it." And he said it plainly without self-pity, just as a fact. And she looked at him for a long moment and said, "That is not your decision to make for me." And he said, "You are right." And she said, "I paid you $50 and I sat across from you in that coffee shop and told you things. And I thought we were two ordinary people in an arrangement, and I structured my whole understanding of this weekend around that." And he said, "I know." And she said, "Do not just say 'I know' like that fixes it." And he said, "It does not fix it." And she said, "So then what?" And he said, "I am telling you now." And she said, "Because Gerald found out, not because you chose to." And he did not argue that, because it was true. And that was the thing about Nate that was both frustrating and hard to dismiss. He did not argue things that were true. And Mia turned back toward the garden, because looking at him was making it harder to stay as angry as she needed to be. And she said, "I've spent my whole life being the person that other people make decisions for." She said, "I was moved from home to home, and nobody asked me what I wanted or what I needed. They just decided." And she said, "I am very tired of being the person that things happen to, instead of the person who knows what is happening." And her voice did not crack when she said it, but it was close, and he was quiet for a long moment. And then he said, "I understand that more than you might think." And something in the way he said it made her want to ask what he meant, but she did not ask because she was not ready to soften yet. And she went back inside, and she sat through the rest of the evening with the smile she had been perfecting since she was 9 years old at a Christmas morning that was not really hers. And she laughed at the right moments and answered questions and held herself together with the particular kind of quiet dignity that had carried her through every hard thing in her life. And nobody at that table except Danielle knew that anything had shifted. And Danielle kept glancing at her the way a good friend does when they are trying to ask, "Are you okay?" from across a room without saying the words. And Mia kept returning the small nod that meant "I am fine," even when it was not entirely true. And later that night, after the house had gone quiet, and Mia was sitting on the edge of the guest bed in the dark, still in her clothes, Danielle knocked softly and came in and sat beside her, and did not say anything clever or try to reframe the situation. She just sat there for a while, and then she said one thing, and the thing she said was, "He did not look at you like someone who was pretending." And Mia did not respond to that right away. She just looked at the floor and thought about it. And the thing was, she knew Danielle was right. She had felt it the whole weekend in ways she could not argue away. And that was the most complicated part of all of this knot. That she was angry, which she was, but that underneath the anger was something else, something quieter and more inconvenient that had been growing since the corner booth at Birchwood Brew. And she did not know what to do with it yet. And so she did what she had always done when she did not know what to do, which was to sit with it in the dark and wait for the morning to bring something clearer. And meanwhile, on the other side of the wall in the room Nate had been given, he was not sleeping either. He was sitting in the chair by the window, looking out at the frost-covered garden and thinking about the back porch and the way she had said, "I am very tired of being the person that things happen to." And he was thinking about how those words had landed in him, like something he already knew but had never heard said out loud quite that way. And he was thinking that he had spent 2 years building a life where nothing could reach him, and that standing on that cold porch being held accountable by someone who had every reason to walk away entirely had felt more real than anything had felt in a very long time.